Hello and welcome. Welcome to another edition of Atlas Information Live. We're your host, Atlas Alux. And before we continue, let's put our little banner up on the screen, actually. There we go. Just so people know what they're watching. Today, we're going to continue on the series that we began many weeks ago that has organically been morphing from one related topic into another, without any planning on my part, certainly. It's just unfolded that way. And if you go back literally weeks and weeks ago when we talked about following your bliss, we are now at the point where we need to delve into the nature of suffering and the real power of suffering as it applies to this humanity. And as you can see, we have resuscitated our Kali Yuga background just for today's talk, because unfortunately, last week and the weeks before, we were leveraging the energies of Easter and the profundity of suffering as it relates to the path of the Bodhisattva, to the path of any growth and development, and its potential to inspire others. And we gave real world examples. And no one can deny that suffering can bring out the very best in people. And that many times this humanity has risen to the challenge and risen at the prospect of the suffering, the pain, the anguish of others, their struggle for very survival. And they have pulled together and they've opened their hearts and opened their doors or opened their wallets and given generously of themselves in whichever way they were able to, or in whichever way they felt appropriate, or indeed in whichever whichever way was required, what was needed by those who were facing their struggle. However, we also know, again, by experience, from case studies, from observations of our world, of history, that the causes of suffering can also bring about the opposite of inspiration. And that is perhaps where we should begin today's exploration. We should perhaps look into just what is the opposite of inspiration. We can very easily discern for ourselves, and we know from experience what the opposite of unity is. But what about inspiration? What does it mean? If one is not inspired by suffering, by the causes of suffering, then what is the opposite in terms of the duality of nature? What is the opposite of being inspired? We actually have a word, of course, and that word is dispirited. And as you can see, the word essentially, literally means to be without spirit, This is a little bit different than the word which you may have been thinking, which is uninspired. And one may think that uninspired is a better antonym for the word inspired. After all, uninspired seems to be more of a direct opposite of being inspired. You are either inspired or uninspired. But inspired as an adjective, as a descriptive of your present state of being, simply means that you are either receiving inspiration or not receiving inspiration. What our focus here today is the state of being dispirited, which is very different from simply being uninspired. Something can be uninspired, and sure, it is what it is. But that's very different from someone who has been dispirited. And it is this discrepancy or this difference, which you may think this is just semantics or linguistics or any number of things which you might find uninteresting or irrelevant. But to be dispirited is directly related to the word if one is evolved, to be devolved is more than just not being evolved. And this is why the Aum of life is such an important way to comprehend the path. Because the Aum of life states, and by its very nature, and in fact, we are going to alter today's background to reflect this. We have a double spiral here. And the Aum of life states that if you are not on the upward spiral of evolution, then you are on the downward spiral of devolution. You see, this is very different than saying you're existing on a flat line, uninspired. You're existing with the absence of inspiration. Dispirited is more dire a state than having the absence of inspiration, which is what uninspired is, devoid of inspiration. But uninspired says nothing about devolution. It simply says it's not inspired. But to not be in spirit, which is the true meaning of inspired, to be in spirit, the opposite of in spirit is dispirited. It is not simply an absence of spirit. It is its opposite in the way that devolved is more than just not evolved. Devolved is the opposite, going in the wrong direction, in the other direction. And this is according to the law of opposites. because so many phenomenon that we encounter has this dual potential. The same kitchen knife that you use to prepare a meal that is given in love and that unites individuals to break bread, to come together, that same kitchen knife can be used as a weapon to divide and conquer, to shed blood, to create animosity, and to create enemies among former friends. Or that knife, again, can be used to host a gathering and a meal and to heal divides and heal wounds and make friends of former enemies. It's still just a knife. It's still just a tool. It is an object that has certain characteristics of action in the world. And so too, suffering cuts like a knife, does it not? When we feel it, it hurts. There's no question. But what does that hurt bring about? The last few weeks, we have looked at a certain perspective, a positive perspective, and the perspective from the path of the Bodhisattva, the perspective of healing and growth, the death of the false self, and the development, the transmutation, the transformation of that pain, of that suffering, of that hurt into something greater than, into something which can exist beyond the reach of suffering itself. And the creation of that which can endure suffering with equanimity, with peace, as opposed to the reactive, pain-filled suffering that we mortals endure when we face the causes of suffering. So what is the mechanical, metaphysical science that we're talking about here? Last week we talked about inspiration and unity. And this week the title of the talk was Suffer, Dispirited and Divided. And as we have often spoke of in the past, the modus operandi of mechanical nature of the Black Lodge is to divide and conquer. So how does that happen? How does one become dispirited in the first place? Dispirited and divided from what? Well, that sounds like potentially might seem like a cyclical argument, but it's not, in fact. It's just something that needs to be comprehended. So let us try to walk through it. And we're going to do so by exploring the facet of reality that we all take for granted, that we all assume is real. Let's bring that back on screen here. There we go. So we have this 3D reality. And there is a universal experience of this 3D reality that we all have. And that comes down to two things. We experience what we call pleasure, and we experience what we call pain. And generally speaking, pleasure is an object of our craving, and pain is an object of our aversion or avoidance. In other words, what we want and what we don't want. That's pretty straightforward. And we can all relate to this. This is not, or it should not be, a controversial statement. But when we consider what pleasure and pain are, and we observe ourselves, when we observe the experience of pleasure or pain, we cannot deny the nature of the experience. And the nature of pleasure and pain, what we want and don't want, comes down to a form of stimulation. And you can observe this in yourself when you observe yourself experiencing pleasure or experiencing pain. Either way, you are dealing with a kind of stimulation. And it's a stimulation of what we have often talked about, of the three brains. We have stimulation in the mental center, in the emotional center, and the motor, instinctive, sexual centers. These are the three brains of the human machine. Whether it's pleasure or pain, one or more of these centers are being stimulated. What we are experiencing is triggering something which is causing a stimulation. And that stimulation can be quite varied. For example, in our nervous system, we can feel we can literally feel our nerves. We can feel the agitation, the vibration, the stress in our nervous system. And we have two types of our nervous system. Our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems can be stimulated. The parasympathetic being that aspect of the nervous system which puts us into the fight or flight mode. And the sympathetic nervous system which puts us into that more relaxed mode, that calm and rest and sleep mode. And these are, generally speaking, how the nervous system is understood in these two states. So generally speaking, the stimulation happens in the parasympathetic nervous system, but not always, but much of the time. And there's actually more than just fight or flight. There's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. All of those are parasympathetic responses. And all relate, generally speaking, to stimulation by way of fear. But if you observe yourself under, for example, the effects of stimulants, if you drink enough coffee, for instance, if you ingest enough caffeine specifically, you can feel the jitters. You will trigger the stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system, and it will be as though you are in a heightened state of fear and a heightened state of anxiety. Even if you are at present not experience that emotion, you might not be afraid, neither mentally, emotionally, or in any instinctive sense. You will not be under the influence of fear, and yet your body will be stimulated into a simulated state of fear. This is a very interesting relationship between these two words: stimulated and simulated, or stimulation and simulation. We'll let that percolate for a minute or two while we attend these two comments here. The first is from Benjamin, who says, "Hi, Atlas. Hello, Benjamin. Thank you for joining us today. It's nice to have you." And Tiffany asks, "Is the parasympathetic nervous system only stimulated by these traits you listed?" No, we are just discussing how even caffeine can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. But all manner of stress, all manner of excitement can trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. It is the heightened state of the nervous system where the nervous system is in activity. It is, again, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Now, this humanity has invented all manner of entertainments, all manner of stimulations, and we even have invented simulations. We call them video games. And those video games stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. The fast twitch reactions required to navigate many modern video games. The dexterity, for instance. But then there's that constant risk of death of your character in the video game, or the constant thrill of being on the edge of death and acquiring some power up or some other goal, points, whatever the case may be, however the game is designed. There are other games that sort of draw the line and stimulate both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. For example, slot machines and games like Candy Crush Saga that essentially zombify you, put you to sleep. And there is a hypnotic, mesmer type activity going on where you become mesmerized and like a zombie, and you're going through the motions, just like mechanically, automatically, like a robot, but you're doing that because of the way the mental and the motor instinctive sexual centers are being stimulated. And it is a simulation of sorts because it is simulating what drives animals to behave in certain ways that is required for their survival. So these simulated experiences that we call video games or slot machines are simulating that, and they're stimulating that. Benjamin says, I am watching an Anunnaki movie. I'm watching an Anunnaki movie. There's a scene where they create the humans, and after it, the god Anu said, after they created the humans, said they cannot alter destiny. So it made me tie the idea in with it. And he continues, our human experience on the graph of time and life, when we feel down, are these two things that we're going through in this way. We cannot alter our destiny. This is not true. So we don't know what you're watching. We don't know the source of it, but it's not true that we cannot alter our destiny. We have free will to do so. So I don't know what you mean by we cannot alter our destiny, like humanity cannot alter its destiny, or we as individuals. In any case, no, and we don't know where you're watching this movie on the Anunnaki. Probably it's on the internet. Probably it's on YouTube. So it's probably untrue. It's probably just made up stuff. People don't understand what the Anunnaki is. They don't understand the allegories of that particular creation myth of humanity, because the Anunnaki are referring to the Elohim. And we were never slaves to mine gold or none of that stuff that's on the internet. That's all superficial, literal interpretations. But in any case, we're going to come back to what Tiffany was asking about, which was on topic here. She says, I believe the sympathetic. Oh, sorry. She says, I believe it's the sympathetic nervous system that is responsible for fight or flight. You may be right. And she says, para is a state of rest. So you may be right. We might have gotten that mixed up, which is not surprising in our present state. Benjamin says, or we as individuals semantically. So off to a good start today. So then we were wrong, and we think Tiffany's right here. Parasympathetic is the rest and recovery mode for the nervous system, and sympathetic would be the fight or flight. The fight or flight state. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Yeah, because sympathetic is active and parasympathetic is the opposite. So yeah, she says, "Oh, brother, no problem. We do it all the time." If only you guys knew what kind of week I had, then you would understand. But we're not here to talk about me. We're not here to talk about the past week. But the past week did bring about today's topic, and we're not out of the woods yet. So if we bumble and stumble through things today, that's why. And Benjamin says, in a deep way, I was making a comparison, but of course we can alter it by the gradual process. I know. He's still on the matter of destiny. So your destiny is not wholly in your hands, but you have the free will to choose it or not, to take another path. That is within our purview. Free will is an absolute law of the universe that the gods will not violate. The only people who violate it is the Black Lodge. They will impose their will upon you, but nobody else will. Okay, so where were we? Right. So we left off here with the relationship between stimulation and simulation. And the difference between the two of them is a T. Now, we drew that T in its lowercase form precisely because a T also happens to be a cross. And a cross, as you know, cross or an X, doesn't matter. The cross, as you know, is a symbol for the law of three. It's masculine, feminine, and the union of masculine and feminine. So the masculine vertical phallus, the feminine horizontal uterus, and the union of masculine and feminine, the cross. This is the law of three. This is the law of sex. This is the creative law of the universe. This is how the universe creates. So it follows, if we want to just carry on with the logic here, that if you start with a simulation to stimulate, to cause a stimulation, to go from a simulation to stimulation, requires the application of the sexual force. Which comes into activity when masculine and feminine unite. That's the T that you add to a simulation to create stimulation. Pleasure or pain, in other words, is created when a simulation is charged with the energy, with the creative force, with the sexual energy. And then the experience of pleasure or pain is had within one or more of the centers of the human machine. But the obvious question is this word. At the beginning, we said we took for granted that this 3D reality is real. But what if it's not? What if it's just a simulation? And our share of the creative force, that we have free will to choose how it flows, up and atom or down and out, which we have talked about in the past weeks. That is the creative force. What if what we call reality is created moment to moment in terms of how that sexual force is applied? But if that sexual force is being applied to create pleasure or pain, in other words, stimulation, that keeps us identified in the simulation, which we then call real, because we identify with the pleasure or the pain. We identify with the craving or the aversion. We identify with what we want and what we don't want. And that we have explained very often, but you know from your own experience, that these statements, want and don't want, they don't appear to us in such a innocuous form. They come to us like this. I want and I don't want. It is the I that experiences pleasure or pain and identifies with the pleasure or pain. And it is the I that obsesses over the past pleasure and pain, or fantasizes about future pleasure or pain, the potential for pleasure or pain. But what is that I? We've often explained that there is no singular I, that there are many I's. We call them egos. And they're, fear, lust, anger, greed, pride, laziness, etc. And they play this game of King of the Hill in our consciousness, this game of thrones where they're jockeying for their place on the Iron Throne. And they do that by presenting themselves as I and getting us identified with whatever it is they want or don't want, hypnotizing us, convincing us that that's what we want, that they are who we are. But all they're doing, all they are these programs, these algorithms, these mechanical entities, mechanical phenomena that just want to trigger primarily our sympathetic nervous system. But either way, they want to stimulate. They want to cause a stimulation in one or more of our centers. And in doing so, keep us identified with what we believe to be real. In other words, what we think is real. Oops. What we think is real, but it's a simulation. So where is the spirit in all of this? Right? Where is spirit? Where is the spirit? Benjamin says, in electrical terms, the I is a symbol for electrical current in amperes, which is derived from the word current intensity. Our ego is like that, which is the current intensity based on outward stimulation. The stimulation is caused because, remember, there is no current out there. The intensity of the current is the sexual force. It's literally the current, because all electromagnetism is in the fourth dimension. That's the same dimension where the prana and kundalini reside. That's where all energy resides. It's the fourth dimension. So the intensity of the stimulation is what determines how identified we are and how attached we are to the particular I that is executing its program to steal our sexual force and to replicate itself. Because that's its all mechanical entities, that's what they do. They exploit, they proliferate, they exploit, proliferate, and dominate. That's what parasites do. And that's what egos do. That's what they do to us as individuals, and that's what they do in macrocosm, in the environment. Benjamin says, but all there is in life is time and currency. In the life that we experience something that we call time, we interpret as time, but time is an illusion. Time doesn't exist. So that's an illusion of ego as well. But suffice it to say, in terms of our experience at our present consciousness, our present level of consciousness, time for us is real in that sense. And the flow and exchange of energy is, agreed, all there is. Or is there? Because we still don't have an answer to this question yet. Where is spirit? And what we described, everything that we showed so far, pleasure and pain, craving and aversion, wanting and not wanting, being in a simulation and being stimulated, and being identified with these statements, I want this and I don't want that. Tiffany says, spirit is watching. Are you observing, though? There's an aspect of spirit which is always watching, but are you observing? Because there's an aspect of you that is spirit. But if you're not watching, if you're not paying attention, then that aspect of spirit isn't watching. That aspect of spirit is caught up in, that consciousness is asleep, dreaming, caught up in the simulation, believing that it's real. And if you are identified with your I, and identified with all the egos, and identified with all the stimulation, and seeking more stimulation, and seeking to avoid the stimulation that you don't want, and if that's what rules and governs your life, then there's very little spirit involved in any of that. You could say that this whole process that we've been talking about, that we've been describing and walking through step by step, you could very easily say that this is a process of being dispirited. Benjamin says, in relation to time, he says, maybe applies to Benjamin's take on the current as the I. That's possible. Yeah, sure. And Mugaboo says, even the most basic life forms, like the amoeba, have an aversion for pain and love of pleasure. Probably all animals do. Isn't this a mechanism put in place for the survival of animals? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And on that level, on the level of animals, on the level of mechanical nature, it's perfectly appropriate. And that's spirit expressing itself on the level of mechanical nature. But we weren't talking about animals. We were talking about human beings, or at the very least, intellectual animals who call themselves human. But remember, we've talked about this before. There's two natures of nature. There's mechanical nature, and then there's divine nature, which we could call spirit. And it's perfectly fine to say all of this is required for mechanical nature, but this is mechanical nature. But spirit, at least in human beings, the spirit, and at least also in animals themselves, the monad is its divine nature. It's not its mechanical nature. These are two separate natures, and they're separate and distinct for a reason. And one of them, if we haven't made it clear, one of them is a simulation. And that a consciousness obsessed and hypnotized, obsessed with it and hypnotized by it, can be said to be dispirited, because that consciousness forgets itself, forgets its true spirit, and instead identifies with its mechanical nature. And without us having to get there, just your questions themselves has gotten us there. This divides us. This separates us. It separates us from our own nature, from our own divine nature, our own spirit. And we are thrown into the wilderness. This is what was allegorized in the book of Genesis when Adam and Eve are cast out of paradise. They're cast out into the wilderness. What is the wilderness? The wilderness is the place of that which is wild. The wilds. Mechanical nature, animal nature. Because animals are wild. They're wild animals. So the wilderness is a state of existence for animals. And that's where this humanity was cast out into the world of animals. 3D, quote, reality that we believe and think is real, and all of these cravings and aversions, all this stimulation that is taking place in this simulation, which we believe and think is reality. And we even identify with animals. We even call ourselves an animal. And people like Jane Goodall wants to convince the world that we are related to chimpanzees, and they're constantly trying to make associations between us and the great apes and the chimpanzees and the monkeys. And Darwin proposed that we evolved from monkeys and all this nonsense. The ego mind is constantly trying to reinforce our relationship with wild animals and with mechanical nature. And all of nature idolatry comes out of this. The worship of nature, mechanical nature, as our God, as the Aborigines called the Great Spirit. But their connection to the Great Spirit is through the animals and through the wild. They look outside of themselves into nature. They look through their own mechanical animal nature as their connection to spirit. But they're connecting to spirit manifesting itself, expressing itself through mechanical nature. And that path, unfortunately, leads to devolution. That path ultimately leads to a dispirited path. I have a couple more comments here. Let's Tiffany says, so spirit along with the soul get caught up in the simulation. Can you clarify, please? She says, this is area I haven't gotten a grasp of. Since you asked where is spirit, it made me wonder again. We're going to come back to this, Tiffany, in a second, but first we're going to see if we can take Mugaboo's question. Mugaboo's question, not Bugaboo, Mugaboo. And he says, I say this because obviously it is more pleasurable to eat a pizza than it is to eat a kale salad. And our flesh is programmed to love more high-calorie foods instead of less caloric foods. This is why early Christians preached to wage war against our flesh. In essence, yes. This second point, yes. And this, when it comes to this point, yes, we are geared towards fat and sugars and carbs and so on and so forth. But make no mistake that modern food science has combined those in ways that nature never did. And we even have things called molecular gastronomy, whereby these so-called molecular chefs create such flavor and texture combinations that when somebody takes a morsel of the so-called molecular gastronomy foods, their brain lights up, the back of their brain lights up as if they were taking heroin. And just look at all the junk food and stuff where you can't just eat one Dorito, you have to eat the whole bag. And all of this stuff that has been engineered, food scientists have worked with neuropsychologists to engineer the combinations of flavors and textures and substances and chemicals that create a stimulation of the human machine that is irresistible. Again, it's all stimulation. It is taking the fundamental building blocks of mechanical nature and deconstructing them and putting them back together in ways that ramps exponentially the effect of those original building blocks. And that's what you have with modern food science and molecular gastronomy, and also the neuroscience of gaming, but specifically gambling and the design of those machines and applications on your phone and whatnot and so forth that make all of these things hyper palatable, hyper compelling, hyper addictive, because you have mechanical minds that are innovating and iterating and perfecting upon the most insidious, manipulative aspects of mechanical nature. And they're doing so because this is the purpose of the Black Lodge. This is mechanical nature's job during a Kali Yuga, which is, by the way, why we chose the virtual background we did at the beginning. But let's go back to Tiffany's point here. She says, so spirit along with the soul get caught up in the simulation. And can you clarify this? And she says, this is an area I haven't gotten into grasp of since you asked where is spirit, and made me wonder. So we made a video not long ago talking about why it is that people can get lost in a video game. And if you've ever played a video game, it doesn't have to be an MMORPG like World of Warcraft. It doesn't have to be a PC game or a Xbox game or PlayStation game or a Nintendo game. It can be a game on your phone. It can be Candy Crush Saga, if you've ever played that on your phone, or any number of free-to-play games on your phone. And you pick it up and you think it's just, you're going to kill a few minutes waiting in a doctor's office or on a train ride or on a bus ride or something. And then you look up and you realize you've missed your stop. Right? You start playing it, you look up and 45 minutes have gone by, an hour has gone by. And you're like, where did the time go? And you realize it's because you've been completely engrossed in this game for an hour that you have no idea where the time went. Your consciousness was lost in the game. And no one can reasonably argue that a puzzle game on your phone like Tetris or Candy Crush Saga or who knows what, these little puzzle games that they give away for free, so-called free, they're not a virtual reality. It's not a compelling, colorful world that's a full 3D experience. It's not like an MMORPG or any number of video games that you might play on a home console nowadays. It's a stupid little puzzle game with quirky little sounds and, yeah, sure, bright colors and this and that and the other thing, but it's not a virtual reality, and yet it's very easy to get lost in that. So you ask yourself, if it's so easy to get lost in that, and let's face it, let's not even talk video games. Have you ever been driving in a car on a freeway and you look up and you realize you missed your exit? Or you've been driving along in the freeway and you look up and you realize an hour and a half has gone by and you have no idea where it went, and you have no memory of the last 50 miles or 100 miles that you've driven on the freeway? Where did the time go? Or more importantly, where did you go during that time? And the reality is you were probably thinking about the future or thinking about the past. You were daydreaming, you were grooving to the music, you were doing any number of things. And basically you are basically driving that car on autopilot. You weren't really driving that car. That car was being driven for you and you were somewhere else. Because you can't remember the past 45 minutes or an hour of you driving the car. And you may have even missed your exit, which means you know you weren't paying attention to what you were doing. So where were you? And if it's so easy to get lost in your own thoughts, And it's so easy to lose yourself in a video game or even a mobile game. Well, look around you. Look at the three-dimensional simulation that you are in. Look at the three-dimensional avatar, this physical body, this physical vessel that you are in, complete with its own personality, filled with its own thoughts and its own emotions, and all these centers, the mental center, the emotional center, and the motor instinctive sexual center, that is all susceptible to stimulation. You look at all that and you ask yourself, is it not possible that I'm completely identified and detached from reality? If it's so easy for me to lose myself in a video game or in my own thoughts driving on the freeway, maybe the only reason why that's possible is because my consciousness is already lost in a virtual reality, in a very convincing virtual reality, one that is able to stimulate all three brains of the human machine, and one which has been reinforced upon me since the day that I was born. For as many years that I've been alive in this lifetime, it has been reinforced upon me as being reality, as being real. And this identity that I have has been reinforced. In other words, my consciousness has been conditioned over and over and over, 24 hours a day for how many years? It's like, imagine you've been playing World of Warcraft since the day you were born. And your only reprieve from it was at nighttime when you went to sleep. And even then, many nights, you would go off into your own little world dreaming. Then you would dream up your own little world. We call it the dreamscape. It's the lunar fifth dimension. And our consciousness goes off dreaming. All the while, our spirit, our essence, our being, our true self is forgotten. We are dispirited. We are separated. We are divided. Our consciousness divided. And we have so many different elements, so many different mechanical elements in our consciousness. Our fear, our anger, our pride, our lust, our greed, our laziness, our gluttony, and so many different aspects and versions of that, pulling us this way and that way and every which way. And we live these lives where we have filled our world with distractions and stimulants. And some of these stimulants are chemical, some of these stimulants are auditory, some are visual, and some are multimedia. We fill our world, we surround ourselves with stimulants. And our life is designed, it seems, to keep us in that sympathetic nervous system, constantly stressing out about this thing or that thing or the other thing, keeping us in a constant state of anxiety, in a constant state of heightened agitation, of heightened stimulation. Because if we are in a heightened state of stimulus, it is more likely that we will remain trapped in the simulation, because never forget the relationship that we've established here between the word stimulation and simulation. To be trapped in craving and aversion, in other words, to be trapped in ego, to be trapped in desire. And we've mentioned this before as well, that all of this, dispirited, we have the word desire. And desire is sire. What's a sire? Sire is what sits on the throne. Sire is the leader. Sire is the king, the alpha, the head of the pyramid, the head of the hierarchy. Our desires desire, dethrone our being, our essence, our true self. Our true self is desired. Why? Because of our attachment to stimulation and our obsession, our being hypnotized by the simulation. This is the relationship between desire and being dispirited. And we are thus divided. And if we are divided from our true self, divided from our being, we are conquered. Because all these egos are now playing their game of throne, and they're all jockeying for that throne. And one desire trumps another, and then another, and then another desire comes, and another desire. And remember, desires can be both craving and aversion. Desire for pleasure, avoidance of pain. And these desires just are constantly playing this game of thrones, constantly dethroning one another, constantly desiring. And they're knocking one another off the throne. And our consciousness, remember, that throne is the loci of consciousness. It's the locus of being. It is the thing that we pay most attention to. It is the thing that drives our will in any given moment. That's the throne of our being. That's where our being should be sitting, our spirit. That's the throne when we get intuition, when we get inspiration, when we get imagination. That's when our being, our spirit manages to get onto the throne for a moment or two before it is desired again. But it's that throne, the iron throne of our being, of our very existence, that all of this is about. You can, and we even use this word, the seat of the soul. What is it that assumes that occupies the seat of our soul? It's like the cockpit of a fighter jet. Who's piloting the fighter jet? Any given moment in time. Who's sitting in the cockpit? Who's sitting in the driver's seat? And that's why we have that expression, in the seat of the soul. Is it our being? Or is it any one of these desires? And their very point of existence is precisely to desire us, to dispirit us, and to divide and conquer our consciousness, because they all want a piece of our consciousness. And that's why, in a very real way, we are all schizophrenic on a very fundamental level, because our consciousness is not whole and unified. It is fragmented, and and broken up in between all these different desires, all these different cravings and aversions, all these different programs of stimulation, which keep us trapped in not just a simulation, but a subjective version of that simulation. We all can't even agree on the nature of the simulation. Because as we were saying, all of this is subjective. All this is subjective. And the root word of subjective is to subject. Not subject the noun, subject the verb. To subject something to something else. Another way to think about that or understand that is deterministic. Mechanical nature is subjective. We have laws on this level of reality, of laws that define the simulation, laws that cannot be broken. At least they cannot be broken so long as one is subjected to those laws. So how do you circumvent the laws? You must use faculties that are beyond the simulation, faculties that are outside of the simulation, faculties that are not dependent on the simulation. And if you use faculties that are not dependent on the simulation, then you are using faculties that are not subjected to the laws that govern the simulation. Now, this was explored explicitly in the Matrix films, where Neo exhibited characteristics of one who was able to change the rules or bend the rules or act outside of the rules of the Matrix. We could say that perhaps the Matrix films didn't explore this or address this in the best of ways, perhaps, but the way that we can comprehend and apply what the Matrix was allegorizing was understanding the difference between, we're going to make this a little smaller and we're going to move this. The difference between conditioned consciousness, right, versus free consciousness. Conditioned versus unconditioned consciousness. When we understand what subjective and objective mean, subjective is determined, deterministic, and objective is free will. free consciousness versus conditioned consciousness. This, by the way, is where the term human condition comes from. This is why we often say human conditioned, because the human conditioned results in human conditioned, human conditioning. And the conditioning of something, when you meditate on that phrase, you feel into that, and you use your visualization, what does conditioning mean? It means taking something and applying some sort of subjecting it to something else over and over and over and over and over again until it becomes its second nature. So you think of, for example, cardiovascular conditioning. You condition your cardiovascular system to be able to have greater endurance, have greater cardiovascular fitness. Well, how do you do that? You do that through exercise over and over and over and over again. It's the same with muscular conditioning. It's the same with learning muscle memory and motor skills. So whether it's touch typing or playing the piano, you have to practice over and over and over again, because you are conditioning the muscles and the nervous system and the brain and everything in unison. You're conditioning your human machine to be able to repeat these activities like it was second nature. We also call that learning. We call that there's many different ways that we understand that particular phenomenon. But the same thing happens psychologically to children in school or to society that is being conditioned to believe a certain manifesto or certain philosophy or certain political stance or religious stance. And the Black Lodge has used this to very great effect throughout history, to the point where people like Goebbels and others have just outright said openly that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth for people. And you look around you in the world today, you see it all the time. This is just, this is not conspiracy theory, and it's not controversial. This is a fact. And if you speak to anybody in advertising or marketing or anybody trying to convince anyone of anything, they are all operating on the left side of this equation. They're all functioning and they're all treating humanity like the intellectual animals that they are. And they're all looking to subjectively condition the hearts and minds of people. There's very, very precious little being done on this side of the equation, and like this aspect of the equation related to spirit, related to our divine nature. Very few people are appealing nowadays to people's higher self, to people's true nature. Most people are appealing to fear, selfishness, desire, or any number of other traits, attributes related to the I, or related to their tribe, related to their political affiliations, their cultural or racial identifications. In other words, it's a very subjective, conditioned arguments that are being made, and they're trying to leverage the conditioning of said consciousness. Yeah, Kundalini King says, yeah, propaganda. But we can't just say propaganda, because by saying propaganda, we dismiss things like religion, education, advertising, right? We have all of these other aspects, which of course, they're all functioning on the same fundamental tenets as propaganda. They're all serving as propaganda. But if we don't spell it all out, people will not make the connections that it's all the same thing, including propaganda. And propaganda is a very specific, people understand propaganda to be something that's very specific. So it's all just mental conditioning and social conditioning of the animal. It's all determinism. It's all essentially training animals, training wild animals to behave in predictable and desirable ways. Predictable and desirable for the few who are in a position of power and authority to exploit the herd. But this is ultimately the nature of egos themselves. This is the nature of desire. To desire, to eliminate the spirit, to despirit. This is the point of egos. This is their job, especially during the Kali Yuga. And they do it exceptionally well. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We cannot afford to be naive. There are many, many, many people, especially those in the New Age, who believe that the world is on the verge of some mass global awakening, and they refuse to face the facts. They refuse to see the evidence in front of their face. They themselves are entirely caught in a trap, propaganda that has been devised explicitly to ensnare them, to despirit them, even as they believe themselves to be awakening or awakened already and one with the Great Spirit and one with Source and all the rest of it, but they're dispirited. Azazel popped in and he said, well, hello there. And he said that twice. Kundalini King also gave everyone greetings. He said, good afternoon, weirdos. Today it might be hitting closer to the mark than normal. And yes, and he said propaganda. And he also said, mundus vult decipi ergo decipitur. So something about the world being deceived, or the world is deceived, and thus it is the deceiver, or it is the deceiver, or it is the deceptor, or something. Anyway, Latin is not our strong suit, so you might consider translating that for everyone, Kundalini King. Now, there is a video on YouTube which you can watch. It was a KGB defector back in the 80s who was talking about the systematic and wholesale demoralization of the West by the communist powers in Russia, but elsewhere around the world. And it's Alexei something or other, or maybe we get that name again, that name wrong again. We might be able to pull it up here. We won't play it, but just because we want you to be able to, yeah, here, it's okay. It's Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov, okay. And he did this. You can look him up on YouTube. We can just maybe throw this up for a minute. It's Yuri Bezmenov. And he talks about, is this interview that he did back in the 1980s, talking about the demoralization of the West and how this leads to control and how it leads to essentially a communist takeover of the West. And yes, thank you. Yuri Besman, thank you, Kundalini King. And Azazel said, and therefore deceptive. Kundalini King translated it for us. He said, the world wants to be deceived, so let it be deceived. Yes, and how to pull the banana out of your ears. The interesting thing about demoralization, that is a word that Yuri Bezamov, or Yuri Bezma, he picked that out of a dictionary. Because to demoralize someone, work with us here for a minute. When you demoralize someone, you are lowering their spirit. You are bringing them down. This has nothing to do with morals. To demoralize means to deflate, to bring people down, to make people lose heart, to make people lose faith in themselves, make them lose all self-respect. To demoralize, in other words, is to dispirit. He used the term demoralization, but after everything that we've shown and been discussing, to demoralize is to dispirit. And when someone is divided and conquered, they're divided from their spirit, they're divided from their being. That separation has taken place, that divorce has taken place, because they have been so attached, so hypnotized, become so mesmerized by the stimulation and so identified with the simulation, and they believe that that's all they are, is this body, this mind, these emotions, these sensations, and the stimulation of those things. Someone keeps chasing that, and someone is constantly living in desire, but they're always demoralized. They're dispirited. And they're suffering. It's all suffering because nothing can ever satisfy. If someone is demoralized, someone has no center of gravity that's a permanent center of gravity. Someone only has a black hole in the center of their heart. And no matter what you fill it with, no matter how much you try to stimulate yourself in order to fill that hole in your heart, it's never going to be enough. And the nature of stimulation is that one day this much stimulation is enough, but then the next time you need this much stimulation, and then the next time this much, and this much, and this much, and this much. And every time you go back to the trough, you need a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more intense, and a little bit more this, or a little bit more that. And it's never enough. And you always need more and more and more and more. Because if you go back and just try to have the same amount of stimulation, it just doesn't satisfy. not even temporarily. It's just, oh, it's just boring. It's the same old, same old. No, we need more stimulation. And that constant chasing of that stimulation and never being satisfied is this demoralization, because it's very disheartening. These words all exist for a reason. When you're disheartened, when you lose heart, you lose the vivacity, the passion for life, the joie de vivre, right? You're living in constant perpetual stress at that point, because you're constantly trying to stay out ahead of suffering. But that's like a dog trying to run away from its tail, because the void is in your heart. The suffering is there. It is the absence of spirit. We said at the outset, it's interesting how we start off writing really big, but then as we progress through we still write big. So then the result is what we wrote at the beginning of the live stream gets really, really, really small. So let's go back to the outset here. And we said that inspired, the opposite of inspired is not uninspired. It is dispirited, because the meaning of inspired is in spirit. And that the relationship between dispirited, to be in spirit, and dispirited is the relation to be evolved or evolving, and devolved or devolving. That's the relationship. To be suffering, then, to suffer, we said, is to be demoralized, to be dispirited. And we also said disheartened, right? The absence of spirit. But here is where we tie it all together, using words, using language, using linguistics. And language doesn't lie. You can't make this stuff up. This is not a coincidence. Another word for suffer is to despair. To be dispirited. To despair. Despair is born out of the word dispirited. And another way, and literally, why is it despaired? Because to be in spirit, we have, let's see if we can pull this off here. We have a mortal vessel, and we have a spirit inside. This is a pair, right? Two as one. United. Union with spirit. To be paired in union with spirit. To be dispirited is to be despaired. to be over here, empty. Just a black hole in the heart. And the black hole is a downward spiral. It's what cannot be filled. When we suffer, we are in despair. We are separated. It is that suffering that is telling us the state of our existence, which is not being, because our spirit is the essence of our being. To be one with spirit, to be in union with spirit. This is where we get the words yug and relegare. Yug is Sanskrit, relegare is Latin. And these are the root words of yoga and religion, respectively. And they both mean to bind together as one. To bound together as one, as in the ties that bind, like the bonds of holy matrimony. Union with spirit, union with divinity. So suffering, the causes of suffering, of despair, separate us. They cause the breaking of the bonds which unite us to ourself, to our spirit, to our being. And we end up as these intellectual animals who are suffering out in the wilderness. Our being is desired. And we end up conditioned and demoralized, disheartened, and divided and conquered. And all if we give into, identify with that stimulation, that simulation, that false self, this false reality. But the same suffering that can make us wind up with all of this, that same suffering can inspire us and seek us to unite. And we talked about that last week, how suffering can inspire and unite others, but it can also inspire and unite us. Because remember, it's a double-edged sword, like the knife that we talked about at the beginning of the live stream. It's a double-edged sword. It's just that we mustn't lose sight of the reality of the situation. We mustn't lose sight of the state of this humanity. The fact that we're in the Kali Yuga. And the fact that for the vast majority of people, they are dispirited, they are disheartened, they are suffering, they are demoralized, they are trapped in the simulation, they are obsessed with stimulation to the point where the streaming services are just churning out content and people are lapping it up. And now AI is coming along and churning out content at an unbelievable rate. And people are just consuming it and consuming it and consuming it. And it is all completely empty. It is completely devoid of spirit. But it is aesthetically pleasing. It has that newness, that whiz-bang characteristic that nowadays people are so easily impressed by. They're bedazzled by it. Like people who go to the circus or people who watch fireworks and go, ooh, ah, as if there was something of value in those fireworks, as if there was some truth or beauty there. It's just a spectacle. And the thing about a spectacle is it is superficial. It's a spectacle. That's all it is. But that's where we are at. Everything is becoming so superficial. Everything is becoming so sensory, sensationalized. It's all about stimulation, hyperstimulation, just content, more, or more intense, more visceral, more this, more that. Yes, there's a small and vocal minority out there that are decrying the devolution and degeneration of what was once very meaningful to them, and they are bemoaning the bleaching out of all beauty and all truth from the things that they grew up with, that define their childhood and in many ways shape their life. And they're watching all these beloved properties and franchises and so on and so forth be completely deconstructed. And they're a very vocal minority, but they are a minority. And the vast majority out there are just, they want more Transformer movies and, Godzilla versus Kong movies and so on and so forth. Just more whiz bang spectacle, more CGI spectacle, and so on and so forth. Just bigger and more outlandish and more spectacular, more spectacle. That's the reality. That's the hard reality, the harsh truth. The Black Lodge, the forces of mechanicity that are behind all this, they're doing their work very, very well indeed. And there's no stopping it. There's no reversing this trend. We write about this in our book. This is something that we all have to accept. This represents the old age of humanity. This represents humanity's dementia. Because when someone falls into a waking dream and all of these different competing psychological aggregates are all desiring one another, to desire, right? Dethroning one another, playing their Game of Thrones, and someone loses all semblance of conscious sovereignty over themselves and over their mind, and they're well and truly dispirited and demoralized, and they're weak on top of everything else, physically and mentally and emotionally, and now they're just completely just taken over by this hurly-burly that's going on in their mind. That's King Lear going mad on the heath in Shakespeare's King Lear. That's King Lear's madness. That's dementia and Alzheimer's, where people are now so lost in the simulation and so lost in a subjective version of that simulation that they start living in their own little world, and they no longer know what's real and what's not real, because they're just so overwhelmed by all of this, because they haven't been cultivating free consciousness. They haven't been practicing the Alm of Life on the upward spiral of evolution. They haven't been seeking that reunification to spirit. They haven't been seeking their yug, their religare, to bind together as one, as a true human being. All right, let's backtrack here because we have a number of comments here that we have to get to. Benjamin gave us a smiley face of a kind. And Kundalini King said, demoralizing someone is an act of murder. And he says, I've survived the act of demoralization. He also says, good stuff, Attlas. Very inspiring and empowering. I will be listening. Okay. Benjamin says, can it also be ascension and descension? But that sounds like a lot of demoralization. Ascension is on a completely different level. Here, we're just talking about being a human being. This is just a human being. Okay? We're not talking about being a Buddha. Well, actually, we are. So let's scratch that. Let's scratch it. We're not talking about being a master, and we're not talking about an ascended master. Okay, these are completely different levels. So this word ascension only applies to well, actually, you know what? We even missed one. Shoot. Okay. Why is this not behaving now? Let's try this. Okay. So let's see if we can grab this and then move this up here. Okay. Okay. So right now on this side, okay, this guy here, we'll draw another one, we'll draw another person here with the black hole in his heart. Okay, the dispirited, the demoralized. This is the intellectual hominid. Okay, this is the human-like machine. Right? He's not. This is not even a true human being yet. So here we're talking first about being a human being. Then, from that level, we have to attain the level of mastery. The level of master. From there, there's becoming a resurrected master, and from there, there's becoming an ascended master. So this is so far beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. To talk about ascension and descension, no, this has nothing to do with demoralization. Because we're talking about a completely different level of existence that we need to try to keep things contained at our level, right? You crawl before you walk, before you run, before you fly. And so let's not talk about ascending and descending in the air when we're not even crawling yet. That's really the best way that we can answer that question. Kundalini King says, I received your reply and immediately began reading from the wealth of knowledge your suggestion led me to. Okay? Right. We recall now, yes. And Benjamin says, which would probably be descension. Okay, so that relates to your previous comment. And Kundalini says, despair and grief, the lowest place. Truly the hell all men fear and do not know until you are there. The irony in all of this is, and he adds, hope will save you, hope, humility, and gratitude. But humility and gratitude, someone has to know that they need to be grateful to someone or something. And humility comes from recognizing that one is not the be all and the end all. And ego is the antithesis of both of those. And so is demoralization, because to be dispirited means essentially to be secular or atheist, but also to be trapped in dogma and belief that God is out there somewhere, because you can be effectively dispirited and still be a religious believer. And you're praying to God out there somewhere, but you have no intimate knowledge of your innermost essence, your innermost spirit. So as for hope, hope can exist. People can hope even if they're dispirited. They do have that capacity, because many of them do. And many of them are hopeful. Many of them do hope. And they're hopelessly demoralized. And they hope that things are going to get better. But that hope it's a kind of false hope. It's a kind of blind hope, if you will. It's like a blind faith, or just a wishful thinking, really, is a better way to express that kind of hope. Like someone is hopeful they're going to win the lottery. They buy their lottery tickets faithfully every single week, hoping that they're going to win the lottery. But what they're really doing is wishful thinking. There's no real genuine hope there. I mean, there is and there isn't. It's a very fine line. It's a subtle difference between the two. But hope really stems from trust, and trust comes from knowledge. The intimate knowledge that everything happens for a reason, that we are not forsaken. These are more than just concepts or intellectual ideas or wishful thinking or any of that. These are born out of our experiential knowledge of precisely that we have a higher self, and that our higher self has a purpose. And so long as we're breathing and we are aligned with that purpose, we are going to be okay. And that everything will unfold as it should. And if we're walking the path of the Bodhisattva, and if part of the unfoldment of our higher being's purpose is that we need to suffer and be sacrificed, then so be it, because that's what a servant does. Servant serves the will of their Lord. That's what a servant does. And the highest service anybody can give is the suffering and sacrifice of their own life on behalf of others. And many bodhisattvas do just that. One might even hope that one's destiny unfolds as it should, no matter what may come. And this is the essence of Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against a sea of troubles and by avoiding end them. Right? Whether we feel ourselves more noble to say, que sera, sera, whatever will be, and I'm here at the behest of my innermost Lord and Master, my true self, and I'm just a simulated character in a simulated world, a game world. So I'm going to dispense with all of my desires and all of my cravings and aversions, and focus instead on the will of my being, the will of my innermost, the will of my innermost player. And I'm going to serve the will of my Lord and Master. And I will suffer whatever slings and arrows come my way, because that's part of my bliss. It's part of my reason for being, because it is an aspect of my being's reason for being here, my being's purpose. Benjamin says, awesome. It still explains the levels as you said. And Mugaboo says, very true, Attlas. As children, most children are very inspired, have a lot of imagination, but all societies that I have lived in demoralize children. We break children very early. Unfortunately, that's very often the case. But it is also true that many children resist demoralization. They resist being broken. They resist having their spirit broken. And we were one such child. We always went our own way. I followed the will of Attlas. And and the path of the Bodhisattva very often has us surrounded by opposition, by obstacles, which we have to overcome, which we have to face and resist and uphold our integrity. We fight for our spirit. We fight for our passion. And we resist the forces of demoralization, the forces of attempting to dispirit us. That's not to say that we don't give in to desire. We do, often, right? Because we're not perfect. We're decidedly imperfect. We came here and we have many imperfections to overcome. But it is in the overcoming of those imperfections, it's in the overcoming of the obstacles that our spirit grows and strengthens. And this stepping these steps from human being to master, to resurrected master, to ascended master, just look at the difficulties and the challenges and the obstacles we face just to be a human being. Now consider what someone walking the path of the Bodhisattva takes on. To become not just a master, but a resurrected master. And then from there, an ascended master. Just imagine the obstacles that they face, that they take on. Because we've often used the allegory of the mountain. The mountain. The master mountaineer doesn't climb the local bunny hill. The master mountaineer climbs Kilimanjaro, or the master mountaineer has to climb Everest in K2. And that's the nature of the obstacles that we face, these forces that seek to demoralize us, to dispirit us, divide us, and conquer us. We must put up a defense. And if we are wise about it, we discover that the source of our strength comes from our spirit. To mount a defense, you must be strong. Forget about power. Forget about all this talk of power and people finding their power and power this and power that. That is all ego. Only the ego seeks power. If you understand the difference between power and strength, you'll know why. And if you don't know the difference between power and strength, meditate on it. Because frankly, it is becoming a bit of a thorn in our side how often we encounter people talking about spirituality and talking about their power and coming into their power. Spirituality is not about giving you power. It's not about giving anybody power. It's not about power. Only ego desires power. Power is something that ego desires, that the Black Lodge desires. Power is what masquerades as strength. But the true source of strength is spirit, the strength of spirit. But if you don't have spirit, if you've been dispirited, you can't have strength. Why not? Because spirit is the source of strength. When you look at the sun, and the sun beating down on you, you don't say, "Oh, what power!" No, you say, "Wow, the sun is strong today. The rays of light are strong today." You don't talk about how powerful the sun is today. The sun is not powerful. The sun is strong. It burns brightly. We're not talking about looking at the sun as a bunch of materialist scientists now. The sun burns brightly. It burns with the strength of a star, of a sun, of an ascended master, of a cosmo creator. Spirit is strength. The sun shines. The sun shines. But if one doesn't have a spark in oneself, or one is separated, dispirited, demoralized, divided, and not united with their spark, with their essence of that Christic light, then they have just that black hole in their heart. They have no foundation. They have no, so there's no, without a foundation, there's nothing supporting you. There's no strength there underneath. So in the absence of strength, what do they do? What do they seek? Automatically and instinctively, as all machines require in order to function, they need power. Do you have any appliances in your house? Can they function without power? Every machine that you have requires power to function, to operate. Egos are no different. And the demoralized, the dispirited are no different. They require power. That's all they seek. And it is that power that they want to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, and it's never enough. Because no matter how big a castle you build, it's like the Monty Python sketch from Holy Grail about Swamp Castle. Well, they said it was daft to build a castle in a swamp, but I built it all the same just to show them. Sank into the swamp. So I built another one. That sank into the swamp. So I built a third one. That burned down, fell over, then sank into the swamp. But the fourth one stayed up. And that's what you're going to get, lad. The strongest castle in these isles. Well, it's a joke. It's a myth. It's a farce. Because it doesn't matter how big or how strong a castle you build in a swamp. You built it in a swamp. It doesn't matter how much power you accumulate, if at your center, at your core of your being, there's a black hole, that black hole will suck up any and all power you accumulate, all the material wealth you accumulate, all the pleasure, all the sensations, all the stimulation. You built your house on a swamp. You built your castle on a foundation of sand. There's a million different ways we can express this with metaphor and symbol and allegory. But if you have at the core of your being the strength of spirit, what the hell do you need power for? What do you need power for? What do you need a castle for? You don't need anything. At that point, you have your strength. If anything, you're going to go through life looking to uphold others, to be a foundation, to help others build and grow. And you're going to be lending your strength to others. One who seeks power seeks to control and dominate others. One who has strength desires no such thing. One who has strength seeks only to, we use the word empower others. But in truth, we uphold them, we support them, we help them, we guide them so that they can find their own strength within. It's like a good trainer helps other people become strong, shows them how to exercise, shows them how to lift weights or do the other exercises that will help them become strong. That's what a coach does. That's what a trainer does. That's what a good teacher does. That's what a good mentor does. A good mentor wants to see his pupils, his proteges, surpass him. And those pupils, those proteges, if they're wise and they have the humility and gratitude, they say, who was it who said, if I reached further than anyone else, it was only because I stood on the shoulder of giants. We can't remember if that was Einstein who said that or not, but it was one of these scientists who said, if I climbed higher and reached farther, it was only because I stood on the shoulder of giants. And by saying that, he was acknowledging and recognizing all of the work, all of the efforts, all of the progress that had been made prior to them arriving on the scene, and how they never would have gotten as far or as high as they did without the accomplishments of those who came before. In other words, if I appear strong, it's only because I'm standing on the shoulders of these other strong men or these strong individuals who came before me and formed that foundation of strength that I then used as my foundation. Mugaboo said yes, indeed, to how many children resist or rebel against the efforts to break them, to demoralize them. Kundalini says, I'm grateful for life's challenges and humiliated by them as well. He says, I'm finding it very challenging to just listen. And he says, hello, Mugaboo and Benjamin. How are you this afternoon? Tiffany says, curious, does the ego draw its power from the same source as the freed consciousness draws from? The answer is not exactly. In terms of the creative force, in terms of the sexual force, the creative force, the ego feeds on the sexual force, which is the force that the spirit uses to create on this level of reality. So, in that sense, the being and the ego rely on the same creative force, the sexual force, the force of Divine Mother Devi Kundalini Shakti, because she has the power to create and destroy. The difference is that the being uses that power to create consciously and to create objectively beauty and truth for the sake of others. The ego wastes that force, uses that force to feed itself so that it can replicate itself, proliferate, and dominate. In other words, it uses the creative force entirely for selfish, self-serving reasons, whereas the being uses the creative force for selfless, altruistic reasons. On this level, on the level of the mortal vessel, the mortal vehicle, and it is on that level that the great, what they call the eternal conflict between good and evil, plays out for the soul of humanity, because the consciousness, the human soul, the consciousness, the divine soul, is being fought over because it's that consciousness that is hypnotized by the ego. It is that consciousness that is dispirited, and it is made to identify with the stimulation and gets lost in the simulation. And consciousness is also a kind of energy. It's a type of energy, but it's not the same as the creative force. It is the creative spark. It's the masculine energy. Even that's not even an accurate way to say it. It's just a more subtle version of that energy. A long time ago, we did a series, we did electron prana, and how everything is prana. Everything is basically different levels and more subtle levels of the creative force, of the body of the Divine Mother. And it's just that prana is expressed in different levels of subtlety at different levels and in different dimensions. But in order for the egos to truly feed on that energy, they need to condition it. They need to subject it to their subjective programming. They need to lower that energy to their level. And in order to do that, they have to consume that energy and have it flow down and out. They have to invert it so that it flows negatively. And that's why when we were talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and we talked about stimulation, that the stimulation of the physical organism, of the human-like machine, is one of the ways that the egos get to feed on us, because they feed on, for example, nervous energy. They feed on anxiety. They feed on depression. They feed on lustful thoughts. They feed on gluttonous thoughts, on prideful thoughts, and prideful emotions, and negative emotions in general. So that's why the cult of positivity exists. But what they don't understand is that the cult of positivity is just like carpeting over mold, right? Because all the negativity continues unabated in the subconscious mind. And you're just repressing emotions, and you're repressing these things, and you think out of sight, out of mind, and I'm going to push positivity, positivity, positivity. But then the egos are still draining you of your energy, and they're still consuming. They're just doing it out of sight, out of mind, like mice in your house that you're not aware of, and they're slowly destroying, or termites, right, in the wall, termites in the wall that are slowly devouring the house. You don't know any better because you don't see any termites. Everything's beautiful, everything's positive, and you're redecorating and you're painting and you're doing all this stuff. Meanwhile, the framing of the house is being turned into, cork board, and you have no idea. But that's what happens in the cult of positivity. So just because somebody is positive all the time, it doesn't mean that the egos are not creating a great deal of negative energy in the subconscious mind, and they're feeding there, and they're multiplying, and they're growing. You'll have to tell us, Tiffany, if we answered this question for you. So the short answer is yes, but not exactly, right? So hopefully we explained it. If not, just tell us, and we'll take another kick at the can. Kundalini King says, the king of an empty castle. And he says, who does the Grail serve? We're not sure where this question is coming from exactly, but the Grail is sex. It's white tantra, so it serves the White Lodge. It's the Devi Kundalini Shakti. So, and he says shoulder to shoulder, as we say. Again, we don't know where that's coming from. It is truly, it truly is one of life's great joys to pass the torch. That must have been in reference to the mentor and protege discussion. Mugaboo22 says, doing very well, Kundalini King. Hope you are well and strong as well. Benjamin Ochoa says, hi, Kundalini, doing good. Hope you're doing good as well. Tiffany says, understood. Yes, thank you. Okay. And Kundalini King says, great to hear everyone is doing well. Okay, so we're caught up on comments in the chat. Since last week, we talked about inspiring and uniting others. And today we're talking about suffering, dispiriting, and dividing. And we started out talking about the individual. We may as well expand it out to the macrocosm. Supin Kashper says, hi, sorry I'm late. No worries, Supin Kashper. Welcome. Glad to have you with us. We were speaking here about strength of spirit. And how the difference between a weak individual and a strong individual, and how a weak individual seeks power to fill the void, whereas a strong individual doesn't seek power, they just have strength. So they just have to exude that strength. So what they're exuding there is their spirit. And it is upon the strength of their spirit that they have the potential to, of course, inspire and unite. And one way that an individual can exhibit tremendous strength of spirit is by facing and overcoming struggles. right? In other words, suffering, sacrifice, etc. That one who exudes the strength of spirit has the potential to inspire and unify others around them and behind them. And obviously, they're able to do that when they show that their strength of spirit has overcome tremendous odds, tremendous struggles, tremendous suffering. Now, one such individual that comes to mind is, of course, Jesus, who conquered death. He went through tremendous suffering, tremendous struggle in the crucifixion, and he exhibited such strength of spirit that he conquered even death. He became a resurrected master and then ascended into heaven as an ascended master. And so inspiring was his story that it inspired and united an entire empire under what became Catholicism and Christianity as we know it. So this then is why we cannot truly comprehend the topic from last week, how suffering inspires and unites, unless we really feel into the nature of strength and the relationship between strength and spirit. And we can say strength of spirit, because it is the spirit that inspires and unites. It is the strength of spirit to overcome the struggle and the suffering. And that's how an individual can inspire and unite others, and how individuals suffering inspire and unite others because they feel within themselves their own strength of spirit calling out to them to act, to do something on behalf of others over there who perhaps right now in this moment have extended themselves and are at their breaking point because they are under such duress, they're under such suffering, they have such a struggle that their own strength of spirit to survive, to endure, that's all well and good, but in the case of the Ethiopian famine, for example, it's not enough. At some point, you look at a starving child and you can see their skull through the skin on their face, and you see all their bones in every rib because they're so malnourished. You say to yourself, it doesn't matter how much strength of spirit that child has, they're starving to death. The practical reality of the situation is that their mortal being, their mortal vessel, is starving to death and suffering tremendously. And the fact that they're even holding on inspires us. It conjures up in us that to dig deep and find that strength, that courage to do whatever it is what we can do to help our fellow man. It is always this struggle, this conflict between spirit and the forces of mechanicity, the forces of mechanical nature, that create this tension, but also this potential. And it is perhaps a trite example. We don't want to, in any way, shape, or form, glorify the allegory, but it is one that, unfortunately, many in this humanity idolize, and they make it a form of idolatry, and that is sports. But if you meditate on what sport is, it's a bunch of individuals who are setting them up. They're setting themselves up against some arbitrary set of obstacles, and then devoting their lives to overcoming said obstacles. And the struggle of that, we don't know if you can remember, back in the 1980s, there was a program on US television. It was called ABC's Wide World of Sports. It wasn't the Wild World of Sports, it was the Wide World of Sports. And it was the de facto sports program, and they did a roundup of all the different sports that week and so on and so forth. And at the beginning of the program, during the introduction, they would talk about what was it exactly? The quote was, "The glory of victory and the agony of defeat." And this notion that overcoming these obstacles, that ascending to the great heights, to the top of the podium at the Olympics or whatever sporting event was concerned, that there was the glory of victory, the victorious, and then the agony of defeat. And this is what speaks to this humanity. Unfortunately, what hypnotizes and mesmerizes so many who are obsessed with sports, and then they live their own mundane life, and they accomplish relatively little, but they live vicariously through sports stars and sporting events, and they are able to feel the visceral stimulation of a simulated victory by identifying and living vicariously through their favorite sports stars or their local sports team. And again, here are these two words, stimulation and simulation. Rather than them digging deep within themselves and identifying the obstacles and the struggles that they have to overcome, that they are here to conquer, that they are here to be victorious over, because every athlete will tell you, even if they're a boxer in the ring or an MMA fighter in the octagon, they will tell you that it's not your opponent you have to defeat. You're in the ring with yourself. Your opponent is yourself. It's like every master mountaineer will tell you, it's not the mountain you conquer, it's yourself. The mountain is just the catalyst. The mountain is just the way, the thing that I, as a I, as a master mountaineer, have chosen as the catalyst through which I am going to challenge my own limits and test my own endurance and test the limits of the strength of my spirit. Now, if you're exceptionally cynical, you may argue that that too is a distraction and that too is a bait and switch. That there are many people who master many things. They don't ever truly master themselves. And that's a fair comment, and one that can be supported through many, many, many case studies. In other words, the Black Lodge, the forces of mechanicity, our desires are very good at what they do, which is desire. Now, this comes back to something that Tiffany was asking about earlier when she said about the power that our being uses, and is that the same power, the same energy as the ego's covet? Well, now you can see it goes a little further than that. It gets a little deeper than that. When you comprehend that the strength of spirit to be all that one can be can get hijacked, can get diverted very cleverly to some other enterprise, such that there are individuals, many of them, who are de facto experts at playing Xbox or PlayStation or some particular game. And there's no particular reward in it for them. There's no professional gaming league surrounding that particular game. They've literally put thousands, if not tens of thousands of hours of their life into practicing that game, into memorizing, into learning, into mastering every conceivable possible aspect and element of that game. And all they have are so-called bragging rights. And often on the internet, they use a handle anyway, which means they're completely anonymous. Now, it is very, very difficult to accept and believe that that individual was born to master a video game. That they put so much time and energy and effort of themselves into something so utterly and completely inconsequential that it has no bearing whatsoever on anyone or anything. It is a complete and total life suck. It is a black hole. But they can do incredible things, what nobody else can do in that particular game. So what? Nobody cares. It doesn't matter. They're not helping anyone. And they're certainly not helping themselves. It is a completely and totally mechanical, reactive activity. It's a pastime. It is just a form of stimulation. But for whatever reason, they're so identified with it, it captured them, and they channel all of their strength of spirit into that completely empty, ultimately worthless activity. Even if you're cynical, you can argue that someone like Muhammad Ali became an inspiration for a generation of young people. He became a political activist. He inspired many people, and he was, by no means was he perfect, but at least he used his climbing to the heights of his sport and becoming, being called the champ and being considered one of the greatest of all time, if not the greatest of all time. He used his position there to have some sort of benefit for others. Plus, he had a fair amount of wealth that he also contributed and to help inner city youths and other things that he was involved with. And then eventually he was also, because he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, he became a spokesperson for that illness as well. What could he have accomplished if he wasn't a boxer? Who knows? He might have been a great imam in the Islamic faith. Who knows? He might have been a great preacher in the Christian faith. Who knows? He might have been any number of things. He might have been the first black president of the United States, for all we know, because he had the charisma and he had the intelligence and he had the strength of spirit. But he didn't go down that road. He went down the road of professional boxer, and it is what it is. We sometimes wonder how many Muhammad Ali like individuals there are who are squirreled away in their basement somewhere, pouring their heart and soul into a plastic box and an LCD screen and a plastic controller in their hand. And they are just pouring their strength of spirit into this downward spiral, this toilet bowl. It would be wonderful to be able to reach them. But that's naive and that's foolish, because many of these individuals are not interested whatsoever in anything spiritual, in anything self-development. They're completely obsessed with these mechanical games, these entertainments, these forms of stimulation for their mind that distract them. And again, if someone can come along and present us with the case, self-evident experiential knowledge, that they were born to do that and that their innermost being is driving them to that, and that really is their passion, they really are living their bliss, We can't rule it out. We certainly can't rule it out. But that's one hell of a case to make with us. That is well, so we cannot afford to be naive, and we cannot afford to be ignorant of just how clever and insidious the forces of desire are. Their ability to hijack our gifts, our highest faculties, including our strength of spirit, our willpower, our devotion, our dedication, and all of our energy, our creative juices, our creative force. And if you want to know what that looks like, when someone who was here on the path of the Bodhisattva, when they get hijacked, when they become tempted and corrupted by the Black Lodge, and all of their faculties, all of their gifts, all of their charisma and strength of spirit and intelligence, and when all of that gets turned to the dark side, as it were, you end up with the individual who rose to power in Germany following the First World War and following the Great Depression. And he was able to inspire and unite an entire nation. And he did that with the strength of spirit. But he kept going. And he fulfilled the Black Lodge's desire for power and dominance. And the result was the Second World War. But make no mistake that all of that was made possible because of that individual's strength of spirit, which was inverted. We cannot afford to be naive, and we cannot make the mistake that all of these New Agers make, where they think that being spiritual and being in spirit somehow makes one immune to the forces of desire, to the forces of demoralization, to the forces of despair, the forces that seek to divide and conquer us, to dispirit us. Because they are many, and they are not only clever and subtle and insidious and powerful, but this is their age. This is their era, the Iron Age of humanity. This is the Kali Yuga. This is their time to shine in their own way. This is their time to where they impress one another and they impress themselves with how good a job that they do at dispiriting, at demoralizing humanity. And we are witnessing right now the demoralization of North America and the West with all this woke crap and this artificial intelligence crap, this transhumanism and wokeness and all this stuff. This is all part of the demoralization, the turning all of society into a massive collective machine mind, a hive mind. That's what communism is. Look, they've already succeeded in China. Now they're working on the West, and it's working. Regardless of what you believe, regardless of what people say, there is no stopping this. There is no stopping the progress of entropy. You might be able to slow it down. You might be able to stall it. You might be able to, win little battles here and there, but you cannot win this war. Humanity cannot win this war. Just as a human body cannot defeat old age and death if all it's working with is its ego. In order to defeat the rules of the simulation, you have to work with faculties that are outside of the simulation. To put that in a contemporary context, Benjamin Ochoas here says, currently Nintendo Switch for me. Well, if you remember, Benjamin, in the olden days in Nintendo games, they used to have what are called cheat codes. And you could put in cheat codes and override various rules of the game. And you could give yourself extra powers or extra lives or whatever the case may be. And all you have to do is enter these cheat codes with the controller. Well, those cheat codes was knowledge that was gained outside of the game. They were not part of the parameters of the game. They were not how you played the game normally. You put in these cheat codes and that this gave you godlike powers in the game. This is what awakened consciousness is like. This is what access to the meta mind of being. This is what the strength of spirit brings to the table to a bodhisattva, where the bodhisattva ends up not caring about worldly concerns, about money, about material success, about fame or fortune or anything of the like, because we're functioning as our player. We're here to alter the parameters of the game somehow, to help others cheat, as it were. And what they're cheating is death, essentially. What they're cheating is the cycle of birth and death, the endless wheel of samsara, the endless wheel of suffering. And we're here to help them do that by supporting them and giving them access to the knowledge that we have access to, and to helping them connect to and pair up with and achieve union with their innermost player, the one who has those cheat codes in order to defeat the game, in order to defeat the adversaries of the game, to overcome the AI opponents of the game. Because if you're just relying on your AI to defeat the AI of the game, guess what? You're at a stalemate. At best, you're at a stalemate. But the law of entropy says that you can only hold your own for so long. Sooner or later, you're going to get tired. You're going to get old. You're going to get weak. You're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to get outnumbered. And you're going to fall into the downward spiral of entropy, because that's the only way you can go on this level of reality. Because that's one of the laws of the game. It's one of the rules of the game. You can't escape that on this level. Your personality, your physical body, your mind, your emotions, all of that is going to wither and get old, and it's going to collapse. So, what part of you isn't a part of that game? It's in the game. It's playing the game. but it's not governed by the laws, the rules of the simulation. Well, that's your player, and that's your consciousness, and that's your soul, your human soul. Those are the three aspects of your monad, the divine vessel, the divine vehicle of the being, from which the strength of spirit comes through. But in order to crystallize that, in order to create that, we have to extract all the aspects of ourselves, the consciousness and everything that's currently mesmerized and caught up in the simulation, that's obsessed and identified with all the stimulation and constantly being distracted by all the different desires. So we become whole again, we reunite, we achieve yug, relegare, we pair up again by identifying the causes of our suffering, of our despair, of our demoralization. And we work through that, and we use that to our advantage to inspire us to seek the guidance and the strength and the wisdom of our true self, our player, the aspect which is not governed by the conditions and the conditioning of the simulation. That aspect of us which is not enamored with and hypnotized by and mesmerized by the stimulation. And if we're successful, if we start to show some modicum of success, we may find ourselves in a position to inspire others and say, look, I once suffered from this, or I once suffered from that, or I still suffer from this. And this past week, after that eclipse, I fell into a depression like I can't even begin to describe. And the reason why we were inspired to devote today's live stream to the topic that we did was because of the serendipitous coalescence of events which took place in our life, where someone very close to our family, she was having a birthday, and another member of her family had a birthday. So we had multiple birthdays and birthday celebrations, and we had candy and chocolate and cake and ice cream cake, and it was just accumulating in the household. And we're an open book, and we've said it before, but we'll confess it here again. We don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't do drugs. Our crack cocaine is sugar. Let's just call a spade a spade. And under normal circumstances, we don't have to touch the stuff. We can eat fruit. We can have a little tiny square of chocolate. We're fine. Under normal circumstances, we have no problems whatsoever with sugar or carbs or fat or food, generally speaking, of any kind. We have no problems fasting and all the rest of it. But when we're suffering from severe depression, food in general, but specifically the three big ones are fat, salt, and sugar. You can throw in carbs, but carbs are essentially sugar. So we're really talking about fat, salt, and sugar. They are our crack cocaine. But sugar specifically is our heroin. And we ate so much sugar and chocolate and cake uh, like this past week, and at one point we woke up in the middle of the night and our heart was racing, and it was then that we did our best to just observe ourselves and meditate. We couldn't really meditate. We could not relax. We couldn't calm the body down. We were just overstimulated completely just by the sugar we consumed. And as we were meditating on this, as we were allowing and experiencing this and just observing how the depression, the demon, which is the cause of our depression, causes us to overeat this drug, which causes this stimulation in the body, which causes the inversion and the waste of sexual energy that the demon feeds on. Because as you know, it's the demon of fear. And as we were observing our body, it was like we were in perpetual fear. The sugar that we had consumed had put our body into and activated the sympathetic nervous system. Our body was in a fight or flight mode. And that we were lying there. It was the middle of the night. We were lying there watching ourselves. We couldn't get back to sleep. We were just observing ourselves physiologically in a state of terror. And it was all just the stimulation of this drug, this sugar. And when you meditate on what fear is and the state that fear puts you in, when you're gripped by fear, what is that? What kind of stimulation happens in your physical body, in your nervous system, in your emotional center, in your mental center? Well, we can tell you absolutely that's the state that we were in, having consumed this sugar, which was a direct result or the direct influence, the desire of the demon, which was putting us in that state of depression. The demon wanted to exert itself over us, wanted to have his dominance over us, to dominate, to demoralize us, to cause us suffering, to subject us to its conditioning. It wanted to execute its program. And if the only way it could execute its program was to get us to consume the sugar, to cause the stimulation that it feeds on, we weren't afraid here or here. But physiologically, our body was in terror. So everything happens for a reason, and we don't share with you anything that is simply something that we read in a book or that somebody told us or that we theorize about or anything else. You know that we deal in self-evident experiential knowledge, and that very often one of the reasons why you never hear the topic for a Sunday live stream until the Saturday before is because we don't know what it's going to be. And very often it's events that are unfolding in our life that make things so fresh in our mind, in our experience, that we've just gone through it. And because we're still on the cusp of coming out of this depression, that we are not entirely ourselves today, but all of this that we could share with you today is born out of our direct conscious experience and observation and study in meditation as best we could, being in a state of depression, which is very, very hard to do when you're being drained of all your energy, to then find the energy to focus and concentrate. It's very, very, very difficult. But we knew, and yesterday, thankfully, we started to come out of it. And by sharing this with you and recognizing that a bodhisattva, he is here to suffer and struggle for others' sake. It's not enough that we just go through our depression quietly, silently, and shut it out from the world, like many people who suffer from depression do, because they're ashamed of it, or they suffer from anxiety and they're ashamed of it, or they suffer from whatever they suffer from. And we suffered that way for many years as well, until we realized what it was all about and why we took on the burden that we did. And how is it that we can transform and transmute the demoralizing forces, the forces of mechanicity in us that want us to indulge certain things? And what is it that they want out of us? What are they trying to get from us? Now, before we continue, Kundalini King says, my crack cocaine is crack cocaine. But I feel you, brother. Big birthday last weekend here for my son, and my wife is a chef. The sugar got me good. In our case, there are other ways that our demon can get to us, and far worse ways. There are other forms of stimulation that our demon has its eye on. So in many ways, binging on chocolate or ice cream cake is really, it's really a step up. But all of us have to make these assessments for ourselves. We all know where we've been. And so, for example, someone who has been addicted to, let's say, crack cocaine in the past, if now, every now and then, they binge a little bit on birthday cake, or they eat a bag of Doritos or something, right? If every now and then they have to do that to kind of throw their demon a bone so that they don't fall back into things that are worse, then you see, the bag of Doritos or the chocolate cake might be a blessing in disguise. And binging on the Doritos, you might not be proud of it, but it's sure as hell better than, methamphetamines. Am I right, Kundalini King? I mean, I don't begrudge you, your wife's cooking and birthday cake if it means getting to 365 days sober, right? There's many people, former alcoholics and so on. He says dopamine can seem like a demon, but it's just a hormone. Well, look, again, the point is that, yeah, you may chalk it all up as dopamine and all this kind of stuff and whatnot and so forth. But at the end of the day, if you can look at your life, I can look at my life, And I can look at 20 years ago, what I was eating, how I was behaving, what I was doing, and what was being done to me in terms of the number of seizures I was having, the behavior. Like, I look at the way I was versus the way I am now. The behaviors I used to participate in, and again, what the demon subjected me to. We're talking multiple seizures a day to now where we may have 1 or 2 seizures a year. And from the behaviors we were partaking in, eating, like a tub of ice cream in front of the TV in a sitting, eating an entire bag of Doritos in one sitting, like this, like it was nothing. And many, many other binging type behaviors and many, many other type of behaviors, including sexual behaviors and the abuse of the sexual force, versus where we are now in scientific chastity, and that we only really have issues with food or with any type of binging type behavior if and when we are going through a severe depression. And again, it's a choice. It's the lesser of two evils, really, because it's either, binge on the sugar and throw the demon a bone that way, or try to resist with all our might and then have the demon do something far worse to us or through us. And again, we all, as we fight and as we face what we face, each and every one of us in our own way, we have to rely on the strength of spirit to guide us and to have the discernment to know, look, we're still not perfect. We may still have a long way to go. But you know what? We're in a much better place today than where we were. And guess what? That is a very heartening place to be. That will lift your spirits. When you can observe yourself, know yourself, and retrospect on where you were, where you started out, and how year after year, day after day, month after month, year after year, little by little by little by little by little, each time you're going down into hell, into suffering, all right, into despair, to face some entity that was trying to drag you down and keep you there. But no, instead, you faced it and you defeated it. You won a small victory against it. And each time you won a small victory, you came back a little stronger, with a little more strength of spirit, with a little more self-knowledge. And this is heartening. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This, my friends, is the Om of life. Mugaboo says, Amen. Progress is better than perfection. We may someday reach perfection, but we're not there yet. But there's only one way to reach perfection. There's only one way to achieve progress. And it's this way. There's no other way. There is no other way. And so we must be charitable to ourselves. We must recognize our little victories, not get cocky, not get overconfident, not become full of ourselves, just recognize, remain humble, remain grateful, and based on our past experience of success, we remain hopeful. Look at these words, full, full, not empty inside, but that glowing strength of spirit. We have what it takes to be inspired, to be in spirit. And we do it by overcoming, by facing and comprehending and defeating and eliminating the forces of despair, of the forces that seek to despirit us. To inspire yourself. Because it takes strength, it takes courage to make progress on the alm of life. It takes courage to descend and face your demons, to face your defects and vices, to go toe to toe with them. We talked about this way back when we were talking about following your bliss and descending into the abyss and returning to base. And remember the baseball diamond analogy and the baseball game, and how you got to go to first base, second base, third base, and then home again. And then you get one run, and then you get another run, and another run, and another run. Let's go back because we have more comments here about this. We got a lot of comments here about this. Kundalini says, okay, they had 65 days clean from methamphetamines. Kundalini King says, dopamine can seem like a demon, but it's just hormone. Yeah, we got that one. Benjamin says, at Kundalini King, I struggled with meth 15 years ago. All I can say is it can be done. Kundalini King replied, my protege died in the shower from his seizure, April 15, 2020. I fell apart after that. Thank goodness. You know what? We have had car accidents because of seizures. Thank goodness no one ever became injured, including ourselves, having a seizure. But it's definitely a risk. It's definitely something that does happen to people with epilepsy, for sure. Tiffany says, I agree. It's very important to take the time to review where we were versus how far we've come and how far we're willing to go, because the alternative is hellish. Because it's a myth that you can stay where you are. You can't stay where you are. Because if you try to stay where you are, the law of entropy is going to drag you down. Like, imagine a plane that's going to stay at cruising altitude forever. Can't do it. Gravity is going to win sooner or later. It's going to win. The law of entropy, even if you have an unlimited fuel supply, it doesn't matter. The structural integrity of the plane will weaken. Engines will break down. hull integrity will deteriorate, storms will hit, crosswinds will hit, the turbulence will take its toll. You have this thing called metal fatigue. Sooner or later, that plane's going to come down. So you're either shooting to escape Earth's atmosphere and the gravitational pull, where you can finally be free, or you're going to get pulled down back to Earth. Just like so many satellites, after their usable lifespan is over, they get caught back in Earth's gravity and they disintegrate, coming back to Earth, right? Because it's either evolution or devolution. Nothing stays the same. This is a myth. There is no stagnation. This is the true nature of the Tao, right? There is no third way in the Tao. There isn't. There's the union of the Tao. There's the Tao itself. But in the observation and contemplation and comprehension of what is beyond the Tao, that's the absolute. And then once you comprehend that, you know why the universe exists at all. So, but that's another topic. So we won't get into that. Again, Mugaboo says, Amen. Progress is better than perfection. And Kundalini King says, right on, Benjamin. The amphetamines actually saved my life. I embraced the experience. I did not fight it. I surrendered to it. And he says, I heard your recovery story and it was so healing. Supin Kashbar says, stagnation means dead energy. In terms of water, yes. But in fact, it's not dead energy. It's just sleeping. And it's the when you say dead energy, then yes, we know what you mean by that. And in nature, something that has dead energy, it immediately starts getting broken down, right? It's the forces of entropy come to break it down. Why? Because it's dead. And nature is there to recycle that energy. Because what's the point of dead energy? What's the point of having an elephant carcass? Because it has energy in it. It's just, as you point out, Supin Kashbar, it's dead. But that elephant carcass ends up being transformed, transmuted by all these bacteria, by parasites, by mold, by fungus. And what happens? That elephant carcass becomes energy and food for plants, for other animals, right? So it's just the transformation of energy. Energy always keeps moving one way or another. Mechanical nature makes sure that energy is always flowing and always moving and always transforming from one form to another to another. So as you said, stagnation means dead energy, but the forces of entropy will not allow the motion to stay, to not happen. In other words, it cannot allow the stagnation to remain still. It's going to be set in motion. And he says, nothing lasts, but nothing is lost. Yeah, everything is all. What's that? That law of physics, the second law of thermodynamics, or is it the first law of thermodynamics? Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It just transforms from one form to another to another. And there is truth to that. There is truth to that. And the entire universe is just a constant flow of transformation of energy from one form to another to another. So where are we at? We think we've pretty much covered what certainly we were inspired to share with you today. And it was primarily this relationship and reflecting and fleshing out, if for lack of a better word, even just brainstorming and getting out a lot of the words and language around the inverse of what we talked about last week, where yes, suffering can inspire and unite, but the causes of suffering seek to dispirit and divide. And one who is dispirited is divided and conquered, is demoralized, lives in despair. And we explained how all those words encode this fundamental esoteric truth that united we stand, divided we fall. That expression, 99.9 times out of 100, people will use that expression as a rallying cry of solidarity for people to band together and stand shoulder to shoulder in some cause. United we stand, divided we fall. But in the context of today's live stream, you know that those words, first and foremost, apply to the mortal vessel who is in spirit. Right here. United with spirit. A pair. Hume and Manas of being. Earth and mind and being. And we have a video that talks about the triune human being and the human being as a bicyclist, but there it is. It's a true human being. It's right there in the name, in the word human being. It's right there. Divided we stand. United we stand as a true human being. But divided, if desire gets in and separates this Hume part out and makes us a hominid, then we are divided and we fall, because the hominid cannot do anything but suffer. Dispirited and devolved. Goes into the downward spiral and gets caught in stimulation and simulation, and pleasure and pain, craving and aversion. And everything on this side. And we get cast out into the wilderness. And we become this machine-like intellectual hominid, the human-like machine. With this void in our center, in our heart. And we try everything to try to fill it with desires of every kind and stimulation and simulation of every kind. But nothing will work, and we live in suffering and agony, and we live in despair. Why? Because we're despaired. We're demoralized. We're dispirited. And that's the state of humanity. And that's the state of humanity. And Kundalini King points out here that Manas is divine mind. We're not talking about the rational mind. The rational mind belongs to the Hume. We're talking about the divine mind, the meta mind of being. That's what Manas is. All right. We think we've covered it. Who has questions? Questions or comments or thoughts, anecdotes, parables? Kundalini King says, until one has gnosis, the best one can do is go for the gold, refinement. We don't know what exactly you mean by until one has gnosis, because our experience and our teaching is the reverse. You go for the gnosis first. Each and every day, you seek self-evident experiential knowledge. Each and every day, you look for that breadcrumb, and you will find it. Gnosis is not something that you attain at the end of your journey. Gnosis is the journey. It's the breadcrumb trail leading you out of the dark wood and into the light. So from our experience, there is no best that anybody can do without gnosis. Gnosis is not the destination. Gnosis is the way, in other words. And Kundalini King also says, well done, great live stream. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks for joining us, Kundalini King. And of course, to you too, have a great weekend. Anyone have any other questions or comments? We'll give, if you're typing away, we'll give you a chance to type away if you want to type something. We have another meeting today at 8 o'clock, so it's going to be. Tiffany says, "Not for me, thank you. As it gave me. Thank you, as it gave me." Surely she's typing something. Nope, gave me a lot to contemplate. Okay. We're glad to hear it. Mugaboo says, "Thank you, teacher." Thank you, Mugaboo, for being here. We remember, I'm just a messenger. We do our best, and this week was a hell of a week. This weekend was a hell of a weekend. We only started coming out of our depression yesterday afternoon, and suffice it to say, we're not up to speed yet. We're not at our best, and we might not be at our best until Mercury gets out of retrograde at the end of the month. So we'll see how things go. But definitely, this eclipse was, wow. It's been a very interesting. It's been a very interesting week since the eclipse. Bugaboo says, "Thanks everyone for your contribution." Tiffany says, "As my mom would say, a hard week means we don't ever have to experience that week ever again." Boy, I hope your mom is right. But something tells me that we have a few more weeks like that to go yet in our time here before we're over it for good. But we certainly thank you and we thank your mom for the hopeful wisdom. Tiffany also says, "Hope you're feeling better. The pressure of the eclipse was intense." It was. What can we say? It's when the moon is doing its thing. It knows how to do its thing, and everything that is governed by the moon, all the forces of mechanical nature, they certainly do their thing. We don't know if you have any animals, if they were howling at it or going crazy, but it's been known to happen. It's been known to happen. So we felt it, yeah, in the aftermath, and did it in the days after. And the weather didn't help. The weather didn't help at all. It was cold and stormy and windy and rainy. So we had an eclipse followed by, I don't know how many days of like no sunshine. So it was like, it was well, it was what it was. And But if the result of that was today's live stream and what we shared with you, and if it gave all of you something valuable and something to contemplate and something to help you, then it was all good. You see, it was all worth it. It was all worth it, right? And hey, I ate a metric ton of chocolate and ice cream cake, so I'm not complaining. Soup and Kashper says, sending you blessings and hopefully a quick recovery. Thank you. I'm sure, you know what, we're on the upward swing. So no doubt in another day or so we'll be back exercising again and back into the swing of things. So we're fairly confident. We might not be 100% until Mercury's done in retrograde, but hopefully we're through the worst of it. So Tiffany says, have a great week, everybody. Fire up. Yeah, gear up for the coming week. We hope everybody has a wonderful week. We hope that you get good weather wherever you are. And we hope to see you again next week here, as always. And until then, we want to wish all of you all the very best. Thank you for being here again today. Thank you for putting up with our not being at our best. And as always, all the best to you and inferential peace. And Benjamin says, praying for your good health. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, sir. Thank you, Benjamin, for being here as always. And once again, just to everyone, we thank you and hopefully we'll see you again soon. And again, inferential peace. Take care, everyone.